I think we've probably almost got everyone, so I'll just start with some housekeeping as the last people join. So if we could just ask you all to keep your microphones on mute throughout the meeting unless you've been invited to speak, and please turn off your cameras should you not wish to be recorded at any time during the webinar. For the chat functions, please use this for any questions and comments. Jen will be keeping track of these throughout the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer these at the end of the presentation. The presentations will last approximately 40 minutes, and then we'll leave us 20 minutes for questions at the end. I'll just wait for the final people to join before we start. I think we'll just we'll start now. So good morning and welcome to our Graham Sibbald webinar on the future of the town centre. For those that don't know me, I am Keith Waters, partner in our Edinburgh office. Town centres have long been debated, and what we do know is their future is very much up for grabs. We are privileged to have two fantastic speakers today. Firstly, Professor Leigh Sparks from the University of Stirling, who will be talking us through the new future for Scotland's town centres. Who will be followed by Jonathan Guthrie, who is Director of Strategic Partnerships at Robertson Group, who will be asking us what we are going to do about it. So without any further ado, I'll pass you over to Professor Leigh Sparks. If you just bear with us while Jen loads up her presentation.
Okay, thanks. Hopefully you can all see some slides there to start with. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming along, and thank you also, Keith and Graham Sibbald, for the invitation to come. I'm Professor of Retail Studies at the University of Stirling, Deputy Principal at the University, and I also chaired the recent Town Centre Action Plan review group, and it's that I was asked to present on today in our report, which was produced in February, A New Future for Scotland's Town Centres. My plan this morning in the short time is to provide some detail of the review, some detail of the background, how we came to the various views we had, and then go through some of the recommendations, and then we'll take it from there. If I could have the next slide, please, Jen. I was asked by the Cabinet Secretary in July of last year to look at the Town Centre Action Plan and to review that, in particular to review progress and scope, to come up with a revised vision for towns, a vision that actually looked at and encompassed our climate change ambitions as a country and focused very much on how we can develop healthier, vibrant and greener town centres. And it's that we were engaged in as a review group between July last year and February of this year, albeit we would have done it slightly differently perhaps if we hadn't been in the middle of a pandemic. Next slide, please. It's worthwhile saying that the background to this is an existing Town Centre Action Plan, obviously, but also a decade of some progress within Scotland on towns, and a context within the towns arena and the place arena that is certainly looked on quite enviously elsewhere in the UK and beyond. And it's worthwhile saying a little bit about that to start with. Almost a decade ago now, Martin Fraser led the National Review of Town Centres, and that National Review resulted in a Town Centre Action Plan from the Scottish Government, followed very quickly with one of the recommendations from the review by the adoption of Town Centre First by the Scottish Government and by COSLA. And over the period as the actions of the Town Centre Action Plan and the 6 core areas that the action plan focused on were developed, so that coalesced around a place principle, which was agreed a couple of years ago, and the Scottish Government's been aligning a series of activities and investment around a place-based investment programme, focused most recently in the programme for government around community-led regeneration, about actions for town centres, but also concepts around 20-minute neighbourhoods and community wealth building. So the context we had within Scotland, I think, was reasonably positive. We'd taken 50 or so years to destroy our town centres, and this is the beginnings of the process of trying to put our town centres back together again. Next slide, please. The broader context, however, is that as a country over that period from 2013 to 2020, we've seen quite a number of changes over successive governments, and the country has some enhanced ambitions as a consequence of that. Community empowerment, and the Community Empowerment Act has been a key element of that. The declaration of a climate emergency is really quite important. And then the development of national outcomes based around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, reflecting that climate emergency and a broader set of issues around inequalities and social renewal. And so looking at the Town Centre Action Plan and looking at the review of it, it is this much wider context and broader context about what we want our towns to be and how our towns deliver against our national outcomes that was really quite important. Next slide, please. All of that would have taken place in any case, because 7 years on from the National Review and the Town Centre Action Plan, it's worthwhile looking at that changed context makes that point. But of course, into the middle of that came COVID and the pandemic from approximately 15 months ago now. And what we've learned, I think, over the pandemic is that the impacts have exacerbated existing inequalities, and in some cases probably developed new inequalities. They've exposed supply chains and a lack of local resilience in many cases, but that on the positive side, the pandemic has really emphasized the value of local neighborhood community. Convenience stores, community stores have had a big boost. We've seen a growth in terms of people thinking about their neighborhood and location and working together, often more quickly, often more simply, and that's levels of government and levels of community groups and third sector groups and private sector working together to actually solve many of the problems that were coming up. So the pandemic has rather supercharged many of these issues and activities. And that was the context that the review group was actually working in. And the review group was drawn from a range of members. It took oral evidence, and some of you, I believe, will have provided oral and written evidence, a long sequence of written evidence. It had cross-membership with other key things going on within Scottish Government, generally around pandemic recovery, and it also undertook some public surveys. And as it digested all of that material and thought through those things, there were three fundamental questions that we were beginning to ask ourselves. The first is, what's stopping the desired development in town centres and in places? Secondly, what would encourage further and faster action to improve the situation of town centres? But thirdly, what activities should we stop supporting because they're actually harming or damaging our town centres? And those really became the theme through the recommendations. If I go to the next slide, please, Jen. The vision that we came up with as a review group in the end for our towns and our town centres are that towns and town centres are for the well-being of people, planet and the economy. And it's that tripartite element that's really quite important. They are for everyone, and everyone has a role to play in making our towns and town centres successful. One of the things we heard on a very regular basis, particularly from community groups and particularly from members of the public, was that they felt that things were done to them, done to their towns, as opposed to them being part of it. And that sense of community and responsibility of everyone within the town, and that their role is valued, really was quite important. Bringing all that together, we identified three areas for recommendations. First, I think whilst we've got a reasonable national policy context, it could be strengthened further. Secondly, if we're serious about reversing the damage that's been caused to our town centres, we need to stop supporting activities which cause harm to them. And thirdly, I think there are some activities we can develop and build on from the Town Centre Action Plan before, but also new ones, which will accelerate town centre renewal. And I'll spend a couple of minutes, if I may, on each of those as I go through. If I go to the first of the recommendations, please, Jen, on the next slide. Recommendation 1 was about strengthening the formal position of towns and town centres in national planning. And we obviously have an opportunity through the revision of the National Planning Framework. There should be a requirement to produce towns and town centre plans. We don't want to add to the burden, so I think this is about replacing and rethinking a focus around town and town centres. But I think there is something about getting those more co-produced with communities. And secondly, we need to enhance our data collection and use at the town and town centre level. We're not particularly good, I don't think, at making all of our data available for towns and town centres and actually using that particular data. So we came up with 3 elements around that. One, in discussion with the Chief Planner, is around National Planning Framework 4 and towns and town centres to be enhanced and included and prioritised within that. Secondly, that development of plans and implemented with the local community with that focus on well-being of people, planet and the economy. And thirdly, we need to think through what the measurement and data for towns and town centres is and how we present it, and what the measures are that we don't currently have. If we think to the climate emergency, we think of the aspects around well-being, then how well do we actually collect that around town centres and towns, and how well do we actually present that? Much of the narrative currently is about vacancy or footfall, and not around many of the social, climate and other measures we need if we're serious about people, planet and the economy. So there's a bit of a rethink about what we might need to do in terms of data. The second area of recommendations, on the next slide, please, Jim, is that Scottish Government should look at the current tax funding and development systems to place well-being, economy and climate outcomes of fairness and equality at their heart, because currently it doesn't look as though they particularly are. We're very well aware that these areas may be rather more controversial than some of the others. We're also very well aware that some of these are not within the gift of the Scottish Government, or indeed in some instances may not be within the gift of the UK Government either. But those discussions and debates are worthwhile starting. We suggested some potential actions, and the detail of these need clearly to be worked out. That there are potential developments that could be done. The business rates issue is a big problem, as we well know, but we need to think about whether we can amend the non-domestic rates to protect and enhance town centres more than we do other developments. We need to look at aspects around VAT and about how VAT is charged on new build or not charged, and charged on renovations and repairs. And we need to think around whether there are other things that we've done around VAT around town centres as well. Thirdly, we need to think about digital tax, at least a couple of dimensions of this. Firstly is the international elements, and you've seen the recent data from Amazon as an illustration of that. So there's international dimensions to that, which are beyond what the Scottish Government can do immediately. But also a digital tax in terms of what the economy now looks like. One of the things from the pandemic, as you're well aware, is the increase in online sales. The economy has now shifted. If we're going to have a tax-based system that's based around physical property and only physical property, then the playing field is never going to be level. But equally, the tax system is not going to reflect the economy. We clearly don't want to damage innovation, but we need to think carefully about whether the tax system reflects what actually goes on. Because if it doesn't, eventually that becomes completely unsustainable. And then, fourthly and fifthly, we need to look at what we're doing in out of town. We need to revisit aspects of out of town car parking because of the climate emergency. And this is not just about retail, this is about all developments. And we need to think about how we rebalance the way in which costs are incurred within town centres and in terms of out of town developments or off centre developments. And then, if we're serious about looking after our town centres, we might want to think about developing a moratorium on out-of-town development, except for particular national level schemes. And that should run for a serious period of years so that we actually begin to reflect what we want to do with our town centres. The third set of recommendations, Jen, on the next slide, are that we should look at expanding but also aligning the funding of demonstration projects in towns and town centres. We've run a series of projects and a series of elements from the previous town centre action plan. These need to be expanded, but we also need to align them. We had an overall request before we get to the 4 areas, an overall request that the Scottish Government tries to expand that amount of money, but to align all the spending in government, national and local, against the various themes that we have. but also that town centre activities, when they're funded, we need to think of that money as being substantial, but multi-year, and also look at revenue and capital spend. One of the things we heard an awful lot was that the shovel-ready argument of there's some money left, let's try and spend it, is not the right way to go. And also that whilst there could be capital spend, actually running things once you've bought things or developed things becomes much more difficult. And we need to bridge that gap in some ways. And I think from the programme of government and recent investment around the place-based investment programme, we're seeing the move towards those elements come together. In detail on the next slide, the recommendations we suggested around 4 areas in a revised town centre action plan. Firstly, we continue to think around town centre living expansion. We need more people living in town centres. We need to think how we can incentivise that and have different types of housing for different groups, but also different ownership requirements within that, and how we bring people back into the town centres. Secondly, digital skills and use in town centres. We've done a fair amount, and I think there's a lot more to be done about the basic infrastructure, but it's how those skills and actually use are developed by businesses and enterprises, and how can we actually use the data to better understand behaviours in town centres. There's a lot of good work going on in that area. We need to bring that together rather more, but also develop that for community use and individual and business use. Thirdly, enterprising communities. We're arguing for a development of a strategic acquisition fund to begin to alter the ownership, development and use patterns in town centres. We want to encourage small business, community enterprise and entrepreneurship, as well as private development in there, and build on local and circular economies. And if you put that into the context of community wealth building, you can see where it joins up with other aspects. And fourthly, we need to think about climate change response, building on the work that's going on in climate action towns, but looking at expanding our retrofitting of town centres, thinking about space use in town centres, how we do active travel, closeness of density of development, pedestrian movement, green space. All of this fits into the idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods and the development around that. So focusing our activities in those 4 areas. To begin to conclude, the next slide. Too often, the current narrative has been around the decline and the death of the town centre. And that's understandable at one level, but the decline is overstated, and people do value their town centres, and they do have a vital role to play. It's also not inevitable. Towns can and should be at the heart of the community, and they should deliver for people, planet and the economy, and they can do that more sustainably than most other forms of physical development. The way in which we've got to our town centres at the minute is a social construction. We've chosen to do the things we've done by the way in which we operate the systems we operate. We can reverse that. We can alter that. It is a choice to be made. And I think now is the time to actually look at the hard choices we need to make about the way in which we organise ourselves. I think we do need to make this happen. And if our recommendations are worked through and implemented, I think we can begin to do that. Final slide, please. Just to say, all the information on the review, all of the details about what we did, all of the evidence and the rest of it can be found at futuretowns.scot. If you haven't read the review, the document's there as well. My details are on the slide there as well, and there's some coverage of what we've done on the review and some broader thinking about town centres on the web, on the blog that I run at stirlingretail.com, and you'll find me also on social media. Always happy to discuss or present on any of these items and any of these things. Many thanks for listening.
Thanks, Leigh, and if you just bear with us, we'll get Jonathan on next.
Thank you very much, all, and thank you for having me along this morning to discuss this topic. The problem with coming on after a professor is I wasn't really wanting to touch on the documentation and the piece that the government has gone through recently in terms of reviewing town centres, but rather to perhaps look back to some practical experience and how we could apply that to the issue that's facing us at this time. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? We understand that something needs done about town centres, but what? Town centres need attention, but they certainly do not need a panic reaction. They need a plan, but they also need flexibility. They need specific place-based solutions, but they don't need national generic ones where a one-size-fits-all. They also need to look backwards as well as forwards. the need to accept the world that we live in today and not to try to force one on us that we might live in tomorrow. They need a long-term approach that will change and morph over time. They need us to do our part, to work together to a common aim. So in terms of my experience of such things, back in 2002, my employer at the time was asked for some support to look at town centre development and management across the city of Edinburgh. The plan was quite simple. How would the city deliver a framework of projects that could become a national attraction for investment and new retailers and new uses for our city centre, while also understanding what was special about the city centre? From that, the city centre or Prince Street development framework was developed. It took too long. It took over 5 years to produce, to consult, to justify, it felt like at the time. But that document laid the foundations and secured and supported developments and investment across the city, including things like Primark and Premier Inn, St James Quarter, the Edinburgh Grand, the New Street, Waverley Square developments, and many more. More recently, the Scottish Government have asked if we could help give a look at how we can rebuild the economy, not just town centres, but more generally, how could we rebuild the economy? And that's brought some of that thinking back and how to develop flexible frameworks that are both enduring, but at the same time will accommodate change. I think somebody might have come off mute. So looking at that experience, let's go back through those headlines, those bullet points again. So town centres need attention, but not a panic reaction. Now, no one could say that a 5-year process with the case of the City of Edinburgh was a panic reaction, by no means. It took too long, but it did deliver something that investors and developers were keen to support. But it delivered it just at a time when the world was falling off a cliff into recession. But instead of rushing off into something new that was going to deal with that new problem in 2007, 2008, we held the nerve. We saw it through, and many of those projects were grinding through the process at that time during the recession and have now started to produce, and we see them beginning to open, like the St James and the developments around St Andrews Square. So what can you and I do about this though? Well, things happen, and the best thing not to do is, or not to panic. Town centres have been around for a long time. They'll be around a long time after us as well. So rushing off to change everything because of Brexit or COVID or because of new party politics will only delay investment because it shakes confidence. It frustrates people who live in those places. But the second point was that they need a plan, but they also need flexibility. We love coming up with a plan, and then we either ignore the plan completely or we stick blindly to it while everything around us burns. But the plan needs to be four-dimensional. It needs to look at a town centre from every angle, from the ground floor interaction through to what's going on in the upper floors and in the rear spaces. Now, oftentimes the planning process likes to draw lines around areas and colour in sectors or identify specific uses. Now, in real life, the centres, these retail centres or commercial districts or residential quarters, they need more fine grain than that. They can't just be one use for whole swathes of our town centres. They need thought through in terms of the time of day as well, that fourth dimension. The time of the day, the time of the week, the time of the month, the time of the year. Who's there and who is using those spaces, and being prepared to differ the needs. Otherwise, we end up with the kind of spaces that we've all seen in towns and cities. Dull, sterile, dead spaces that in the evening or during the day or at weekends. So when an opportunity arises, excuse me, that doesn't quite fit the plan, let's not be quick to dismiss it, but rather go back to the first principles of that place. Go back to the people and the communities that live there and find out if we can flex or adopt that proposal as part of our plan. And this is the hardest bit in the world. When a policy is set, the plan is consulted, it's debated, it's adopted. Any deviation can be really, really difficult, but it is worth doing. I have the scars, I've been there, done that, but it is worth doing. So look at our town centre. What did it used to be? Are the buildings still being used for the use that they were intended? It's not likely, because we've learned to adopt and to change and adapt. And that's something that we seem to forget how to do 50 plus years ago. So what can you and I do about this? Well, as we've heard from Leigh, policymakers and designers, government officials and local government officials, developers, investors and specialists, do we really recognise the place? Do we really recognise why the plan exists? So rather than just applying a policy or following a plan without understanding it, potentially dismissing anything that doesn't fit, let's make sure we do understand that place. The next point was that the need to be specific, a place-based solution, not a national generic one-size-fits-all. Applying a national approach to your local town centre will only ever result in bland, generic and potentially unsuitable or unsustainable uses for your place. Now, whether this approach is planning or transport or investment or brand or valuation or accessibility, whatever it is, it needs to be unique to the place that is your town centre. There are national considerations. For instance, transport connects one place to another, and therefore will need an element of common approach for either end of that journey. But to apply a national policy to things like, for instance, social distancing retrofitting ends up with totally inappropriate installations for pedestrian spaces, cycle segregation, car parking and bus stops. I'm sure we've seen these around our towns and cities just recently, with the result that the very thing that they're trying to achieve to ease the smooth interaction of people around our town centres actually becomes one of the most awkward things. Town centres are unique. They're home to unique communities, and the idea that a national policy can deliver what that local community needs will never work. So what can you and I do about this? Well, like the last area I mentioned, do we understand that place? What makes it that place and not just any place? A national approach has led to the development of lots of activity, but as we found out and as we see, we also have lots of bland anywhere places rather than unique places. But we also need to look backwards as well as forwards. Now, what makes a place special is likely to be buried in its past, something that led to that place being there in the first place. And special places are likely to be special because someone took the time to think, to plan, to deliver a long-term plan at some time in the past. Historic town centres and gardens and landscapes and buildings, they can teach us what it means to think long-term and to plan for that future. Understanding a plan from the past can help us to look to the future. And when we really understand the vision of why we value that place, then we can start to augment that place, to enhance it, but only if we too have that kind of future vision. But often, as we see today, the history of a place can be seen as a constraint, either seen as preventing something from happening or needing something historic removed. Now, this view has not been helped over the last 50 years plus again by a just say no approach to historic building fabrics being adapted or altered. Now, while not suggesting for a minute that there's a free-for-all on historic buildings, how many of them actually look like they did when they were first designed, when they were first built? Historic buildings and landscapes, if your town centre has them, are likely to be the greatest assets and attraction in your town centre, but will likely need the adaptation to stay relevant to the people that live in that town centre. A sensitive and flexible approach to historic buildings and infrastructure is the only way to maintain them and keep them relevant. What can you and I do about this? Well, placing a value on the place rather than just the brands and the spaces or within that place will help us to manage, not just preserve, the special nature of that place. Understand the history that made that place, what it is today, and let's work with that. Unless, of course, the history has delivered something uninspiring or unloved by the community. The next bullet was to the need to accept the world that we live in and not try and force a world that we don't live in onto us. Now, this is fairly self-explanatory. Utopic visions or complicated accessibility solutions or inhuman scale of development, these decisions should really place a value on the place or the people, but they don't, because they tend to look at their own ends, the policy's end, as it were. Our town centres going forward will need to become more things to more people. Will people and visitors alike understand that place? Because quite often we'll design for one or the other, following a tourism and leisure policy or following a local community policy, rather than understanding that those places are the same thing. They're the same place, but with multiple policies applied to them. So as a retail or commercial or residential mix starts to change, as Leigh mentioned, we will start to force the status, or rather, will we try and force the status quo, just maintain the planning policy for each of those areas and maintain zones and use classes at all costs? Or will we learn to adapt? Now, what can you and I do about this? Well, looking at proposals in context of place and understanding them will help us to understand this brave new world. There will be less distinct lines between retail, commercial, residential and other spaces, but that's okay. Not long ago, a national policy was launched to encourage living above the shops. I don't know if you remember that back in the early noughties. An attempt to mix up retail and bring back upper floor spaces back into life. It had mixed results due to valuations and planning issues, but guess what? In the past, living above the shops was the norm. In other countries around the world, living above the shops is still the norm. So when we embrace opportunities that feel right and get a good reaction from the people who either live there or used to live there or would like to live there, we can have assurance that we're doing the right thing. But these all need that long-term approach, but that long-term approach will need to morph and change over time. Town centres have never stayed still. Shops have come and gone, buildings change uses, streets change, infrastructure gets added or removed. Maintaining a policy for too long can constrain that organic development of a town centre. And at the same time, balancing this requirement for long-term historic vision will help us to understand the nature of that place. But what will change in this post-Brexit, post-COVID world? Well, there's a few things that I hope for, and let me just run out on this. I hope that we will see more value placed on unique opportunity. I hope that we'll see less generic approach to brands and valuation and policy and developments. I hope that we'll see more use made of the space in town centres, the spaces between buildings, and that these spaces may be difficult to value on an appraisal, but the value to the community and therefore the success of that place can be immense. I hope that we understand that policy is not a vision. Similarly, stating an aim that we want to be the best or the biggest or the most carbon neutral or the first or the last, whatever, is not a vision. I hope that we will see a much finer grain of attention to development of town centres. If less people work in town or city centres, is that really a disaster for the retail core, for transport plans, for the economy? Do workers add more to the economy 3 times a day, in the morning and at lunchtime and on the way home, than if that place had a healthy residential core? I don't know the answer to that, by the way. I'm just asking that question. I hope that we'll be able to look at the way people interact and avoid bizarre and complicated accessibility solutions that seek to segregate people rather than integrate them. I hope that we'll be flexible in our understanding of what we have, that local authorities will look at the place and the people and understand it, that portfolio investors will look at what they own and the long-term value of it, not just today's income or valuation or dividend. I hope that occupiers will look at what they bring to the place that is unique and attractive, that designers and consultants will recognise the opportunity rather than just following a policy, either their own or someone else's. I hope that we'll be prepared to challenge norms and have a plan that enhances the place and the community. The opportunities are immense, and Leigh touched very briefly on one about retrofitting. Retrofitting is an enormous opportunity for, whether that be for energy performance or whether it be for uses of buildings, because it gives us the ability to get it right, to create jobs, to create investment opportunities, to rebalance our town centres and to make them more relevant once again. But all of this requires the last thing, which is that we all do our part, working together to common aims. COVID has taught us many lessons, and many of them have been hard and many of them have been painful. We have lost much, not least loved ones, and perhaps many things that we took for granted. We've learned new ways of working and adapted to these quite quickly. For our town centres, we need to be prepared to work together in new ways, adapting to new norms, rewriting policies, the rule books, spreadsheets, or even apps. Instead, we need to understand each other, the place and our proposals, and how that will impact on that place. Do we really understand what my town centre needs? Do I understand who goes to my town centre, who lives there, what space is available? What could that space be used for, and will we understand it and embrace it? Most of all, we need to be prepared to work together to common aims across traditional boundaries, looking after our town centres, adapting to new uses and leaving something that we can be proud of for the future. Just like Bob the Builder, or for older viewers, the mice on the mouse organ, we can fix this. And back to our host now.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Leigh. Jen will now have a look at the chat and maybe have some questions for both of you guys to field.
Hello all, yes, we do. So to get us started, if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask, please use the chat function to type in anything that you would like for our guest speakers. You can also use the raise your hand option and we can then invite you to speak if you would like. So let's go to our first question. This is from Graham Miller from Sheridan Property. So he says, who do the panel believe are largely at fault for the collapse of the Scottish town centres? To use Falkirk as an example, there are 18 vacant retail units on the High Street with a further 12 vacant units in the Howgate Shopping Centre, whilst the Calendar Square Shopping Centre has been shut down for good by the landlord. Do the panel genuinely believe that the town centres such as Falkirk and other similar towns like Glenrothes, Kirkcaldy, Kilmarnock, etc., who are all experiencing similar situations, can be saved? And what would be the key, in your opinion, to get consumers back into the High Street? Who would like to take that one?
I'll say one thing to start with, if I may. I think the question rather puts together high streets and town centres, and I think one of the things we have to think about, as Jonathan so eloquently said, is about towns and town centres and what they're for and who they're for. And it's not just about the high street and the commercial part. It's about all the elements that fit together to make a place and to make those places different and distinct and unique. So I think you need to be very careful about focusing purely on the vacancy on the commercial side of it, because there's so much more to town centres. Do I believe those town centres do have a future? Yeah, I absolutely do. And that's the key part of it. We have choices to make, as I tried to say. And I think if we make those choices, we will get an awful lot of things right.
Yeah, Jen, I think my response to that too would be similar to Leigh, that there's no one party to blame, if you like, for what's happened in many of our town centres, but rather it's just been a culture or perhaps an era of inappropriate working together, where many have looked after their own piece of the jigsaw puzzle, for instance, without actually understanding what that picture is. So those pieces have all been slotted in the wrong places, and perhaps the straight edges aren't even there. So I think rather than looking back or blame, I think we should look back to find out what went wrong and then start looking at how we can do that differently. Because I do honestly believe that there is no such thing as the inevitability of a recession. I think the inevitability is that we've got an opportunity here that we can grasp and grasp as a wider community by working together.
Perfect, thank you both. Our next question from Derek Richardson, he has asked, have the poor residential and commercial development decisions made in town centres in the last 50 years, particularly those with heritage, meant that planners and councillors are now less likely to approve new modern schemes that would have a real benefit to the town and its population?
I'll let Jonathan go first this time.
Thank you, Leigh. Yes and no. I think yes, that there probably is there will be that sort of historic memory of things that have perhaps gone wrong, where poor decisions have been made. But whether that means that a committee will decide against something just because they've seen poor examples of it elsewhere, or not, I don't know. What I do know is that with the council elections coming up, I know that there's a lot of impetus to try and to have things consented in advance of those. And I think that drive towards doing things within a timescale can be quite difficult and dangerous sometimes, and that's having been on the development side and the investment side. But I also think that we'll have some new councillors coming in who perhaps don't have that memory of what's gone wrong in the past, and perhaps there is more of an opportunity to start looking at longer term plans. But they have to be right for the place, because at the end of the day, it's for the community we're doing it, it's not for councillors or planners. We're doing it for people who actually live in these places, real people like you and me.
I'd like to think that there wouldn't be that sort of stifling, as I think the question actually posed it. But I think we have to recognise that it will be variable across different places. But if you understand what the town needs and you can see developments coming through that actually benefit in that way and what communities want, I would like to think that there is a positive sense of what we can do and that would come forward. But I recognise it could well be slightly patchy.
Thank you both. Our next question comes from Graham Ross. He says, to restore our town centres, do we need to look at the balance between local and national retailers? And secondly, should we be encouraging local rather than national landlords? In his view, this would encourage more, both in terms of reinvestment and realistic rentals.
I think if you look, and I'll stick with retailing just for a moment, if you look at what's happening on the retail side, then clearly we're seeing a withdrawal of many national chains from many locations. And I think that's been the big issue. I think going under the radar has been quite an interesting set of developments at the local level. We see it here, we see it in a number of different places across the UK, not just Scotland, where independent retailers are opening up and are seeing opportunities to develop. And I think that swing back in terms of that balance between national and local, I think is really quite important and quite significant. I think we ought to encourage that. If we think about local multipliers, we think about some of the activities around community wealth building, all of the things about building resilience into the local community, in the local area. I think that balance between local and national has to be rethought, but is being rethought because of what's happening. That's not to say it's one or the other. There'll always be a role for national players, and there'll always be a role for private as well as public investment in town centres. But that balance, I think, is shifting. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I think the balance between national and local is also further complicated by the idea of whether it's available online or whether it's something I can do more easily from my home, from a phone, whatever it might be. So I think whatever that use is, whether it's a national or a local retailer or brand or whatever, it has to be an attractor. It has to want, people need to want to go there rather than have to go there. So I think that there's that as well.
Excellent. Our next question, so Alistair Morrison has said, could Leigh's idea of strategic acquisition fund lead to the public sector having to take an ownership stake in town centre property over time? This would be a reversal of current trends, but perhaps not unwelcome.
I think the thinking behind what Alistair has written there, I think is dead right. I think that balance, is this the privatisation of town centres and get rid of all public, all private investors? Clearly not. But it's that rebalancing, and it again feeds into that local element. It may be local authorities, which then open up some of the independent and other opportunities. It's also community groups and the third sector as well. I think that mix and diversity is what we're after, and that difference. It'll vary from place to place, but I think we do need to get that approach in place.
Yeah, and I think I would agree again with Leigh that getting the mix right rather than saying it should be one thing or the other is probably more important than whether or not there's a big national fund there. Public spaces and the spaces between buildings are probably best curated by the public sector, as long as there's enough investment into those to maintain them to the kind of quality that we all expect from international spaces.
Excellent. Alan MacDonald has said he's pretty sure the vast majority of us will be back in the offices on a near full-time basis once investment and pension funds see downward pressure on rents. So the real issues, excluding COVID, should be looked at via city centre living strategies and joined up transport policies, which he notes Manchester is now championing. What other issues need to be addressed to see all-day use of city centres?
Well, if I could maybe just jump in there, I think the all-day usage of a city centre is largely down to what's on offer. So if our town centre has become aligned to a very specific 3 blips in the day type offer in morning, lunchtime and evening, then it probably doesn't cater for, or very well for, people who might want to live there. But as well as that, I think policy's got a lot to do with this, and Manchester are doing a really good job. Manchester have done a good job for this sort of thing, arguably for quite some time. So just seeing the mix of uses being a bit more rounded, and as I've mentioned in my presentation, less about two-dimensional planning, where zones or districts are all one thing or the other, and the blending of uses doesn't really happen. I think it's far healthier for city and town centres to be much more blended in their uses, taking to approach the full height and depth of buildings and blocks, and how those uses can sit together like they do elsewhere.
I think there's a distinction to be drawn possibly between, if we think of Scotland, the city centres, and particularly the big city centres we have, and other towns. And I think we need to think through, I think cities do have some issues, particularly where we don't have the tourism side in terms of Edinburgh and so on. I don't know whether we will all be back in offices. I suspect not. And I suspect we're going to adapt to a very different pattern as a consequence. And that does have opportunities for many of our smaller towns and many of the travel that we've had before. I don't think it'll be back to where we were. If it is, I think there's a problem, because I don't think the situation was sustainable beforehand. And I think we're returning to something that people are not very happy with in any case, and we've learned that over the period. The other thing about the all-day uses, and it goes back to the point that Jonathan made and we made in the report as well, places are distinct and different and unique. They need to understand themselves, they need to have that vision and that story, and they need to understand what assets they've got that are going to attract both local and other people to that town at particular points. And if they don't understand those assets over the day, then you won't get that all-day element. So what is attracting people to go there, not what's forcing them to go there, becomes much more important.
Thanks, Leigh. Jen, I don't think I can see any other questions. So unless anyone's got any final questions, I think that wraps it up for the morning. So once again, thank you to Professor Leigh Sparks and Jonathan Guthrie, both fantastic presentations, and these will be made available. I think both the slides and then a recording of the presentation will be made available to everyone. So thank you once again for joining.